as a yes. All right. So let's start off with approval of our previous minutes. So is there any feedback on our previous minutes? Anyone needs to provide? Any call outs? I can't see any hands being raised.
As far as I know, all the feedback that's been provided has been incorporated and there's no outstanding feedback.
Fantastic. So are we okay to pass these minutes? And do I have someone to motion that?
I'll motion it. Jai.
Thanks, Jai. Did anyone second it?
I'll second it.
Thanks, Angus. All right, we'll take that as moved. Any outstanding action items?
Sorry, hang on. I've just put up the put up the poll.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Oh, we still have some people joining in too. For those of you just joining in, we're just looking at our last meeting's meeting minutes, remembering you have three options. You can confirm them, you can provide the negative vote, or you can abstain if you haven't had a chance to read through them. All three are completely fine.
Okay, I'm going to end the poll. We've got everything but the very latecomers, and I'll share the results. So yes, that motion is moved.
Great. Thanks, Danielle. Appreciate that. The next thing that we were looking, oh, we've even got more people joining. The next thing we're looking at doing in our agenda is our action items, and we have one outstanding action item. Am I all right with that, Danielle? It's providing feedback.
Yes, at the close of the last meeting, the action was on really all technical design group members to go through those proposed use cases and provide their feedback in this fortnight period. And I know several people have, which has been really fantastic.
Brilliant. So a quick call out to the group more broadly now. Does anyone have any concern with that they need to call out in the forum? Are we happy to take that as being actioned? I'm not seeing any hands. Okay. I think we can take that as being completed, Danielle. All right. Oh, I do have a hand. Who I don't see who it is. I'm sorry.
Jamie Whale, consumer rep. I just thought it was important in the diagnostic pathology ones. I think you've got somewhere. I'm trying to remember offhand, but just clinical data, and that's for Medicare records. But I think it's also important that in this exercise that we're actually giving pathology labs the clinical data as well, because that it can inform the testing, and it can certainly inform the reports back. And I'm fresh from a Sentinel event panels where this was the case, so I'm highly alerted to it. That I think throughout all this we should be emphasising clinical data on the request forms for pathology.
Yeah, absolutely, Janie. Absolutely agree with you on that. This entire standard is actually focused on actually that clinical data. So I completely agree. Whilst there are, the business and administrative data that needs to go along with things like identity and all the rest of it, the clinical is absolutely the critical component of all of this.
Yeah. And it's not always that you've reached abnormal results, but a trend is important. So it is important, the clinical data.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was a bit slow. I was trying to find the right button.
Right. Is there any other comments?
No, that was
How about from anyone else? Anyone else have any last minute comments before we move to the next item? No? Okay. Thanks for that, Jenny. Appreciate that. We're going to move to the next item. We've got a lot to get through today, and I'm conscious that this is going to get very tight in this meeting quickly. So the next part of our agenda is to look through a hypothesis for an eRequesting future state. Now, I think it's really, really important that we call out at the start of this conversation that what's being provided here is at a request of this group. The TDG asked for a bit more direction and clarity on where the government was considering and thinking for a future state landscape around eRequesting to ensure that we can build a fire implementation guide that's fit for purpose, that doesn't just look at what we're doing in our current workflow in a current state, but also thinks about a future state environment and some of those concepts that we may want to adopt into the future. This hypothesis, and I need to stress this to all of you, it is really, really important that you look at this for what it is, which is a consideration, a speculative consideration of the things that the government are currently considering as the art of the possible. These are areas and concepts that we are looking into as what might be appropriate for our future state, and it needs to be really carefully laid out in front of you that this is not a decision of government. This has not been put in front of government for it to make decisions on, and this has not been built out as a detailed design. The Digital Health Agency and the Department of Health and Aged Care are working closely together to work on a future state, and some of these concepts are certainly going to be part of that conversation moving forward. But there is lots and lots of work still to be done. There is lots of detailed architectural conversations that need to be had to work out what is viable and, in fact, what is fit for purpose for our ecosystem, what will actually work within our space, both from a clinical perspective, from a patient perspective, from a business perspective, and from a government perspective. All of these aspects need to be carefully considered going forward. And what we're putting forward now is just a slideshow of our early thinking to help guide the conversation and give a little bit more understanding about what we mean by a possible future state. So today what we're going to have is David Haycock, who's an advisor within the digital health branch of the Department of Health and Aged Care and works with me very closely on this work. He's going to walk you through some of the concepts that we've been building out over the last few months. And this is a combination of a couple of years of work now in terms of lots of consultation, lots of deep conversations with people, with industry, with peak bodies, with government bodies about what could happen and what might get the best possible outcomes. Some of the important context that you're going to see here is that we are starting to look away from some language that you will have heard in the past. The past conversations that we've had around a possible eRequesting ecosystem have started to lean towards the government build it all, get big service channels that we would ask people to plug into, and the government would build it and lead it and maintain it. What we're looking now towards is actually moving quite a long way away from that into a distributed ecosystem where industry and government work in partnership more together, and we actually share a responsibility of bringing that ecosystem forward. And the Digital Health Agency is doing some amazing work in this space. So I've got to pay a bit of a hats off to the work that's being done under Peter O'Halloran and his team, because they are doing a lot of really interesting research in this space to work out what a future state could actually look like and what's the best possible outcome for this environment. Now, you're going to see comments in here on this page, for example, the Health Information Exchange, HIE, which is a concept that's been discussed around a number of governments, both state level and Commonwealth. We're not putting forward a plan for what that Health Information Exchange will look like, and that's the work of the Digital Health Agency. They will be bringing that out in due course. What we're looking at here is some of the concepts that might marry up with that planning and that futuristic ecosystem. So when we talk about some of the high-level concepts, the HIE for us is how we're going to bring this ecosystem forward. We don't want to provide a new standalone service. We want this ecosystem to work within the broader health ecosystem and to be a repeatable service. So with that note, and before we go into it, David, are you ready to go?
Yep.
Excellent. We might hand over to David now. And if you have any questions, can you start putting them in the chat for us? We'll take a note of those. And we'll provide some time at the end of this for a bit of a Q&A session. And if we don't get to those questions, we'll take them offline and come back to you offline with them. But over to you, David.
All righty. Thanks for the intro. Again, we might sound really confident while we're presenting this, but please don't let that interfere with the idea that this is really speculative. We're right at the beginning of the journey. Many of the concepts, though, we've worked through these concepts with the Digital Health Agency, so we're pretty sure about the feasibility, the technical feasibility of many of these concepts. So it's not just a thought bubble. There's been a bit of thought, but we've got a long way to go in the development of these concepts. So let me talk about why we're doing this. We're trying to drive value through this approach. And the first thing we want to try and do is reduce the duplication of diagnostic services. Now, there is some evidence from around the world that there's potentially a lot of duplication in the system. And what we want to be able to do, as we've discussed with many of you before, is make sure that people are making, clinicians are making good choices, informed by previous clinical information, to make sure that they can reuse tests that have been done in the past, or order more appropriate tests and diagnostic services. We're also going to really keep hammering on this idea of driving consumer choice. Now, this has got to be a balanced approach. We're hearing from many groups in this working group about the potential downsides of forcing consumer choice in a particular direction. And we want to make sure that we've got a balanced approach that gets the best clinical outcomes on one hand, and really does respect and enable the role of clinicians to guide patients, while also increasing health literacy and opportunities for patients and health consumers to drive choice themselves. We want to improve communication and visibility. We see this as one of the key value sinks in this entire workflow, where clinicians and providers spend significant time talking to each other, trying to figure out where things are up to, and trying to find the results and reports and images and things like that. Also, government needs more visibility of what's happening in healthcare in order to make better decisions. At the moment, this cycle of healthcare, of change in things like MBS and policy simply takes too long. Our world is changing faster and faster. We need more data, more visibility in order to make better decisions, not only to support patients, but to support industry as well. Now, if I can get to the next slide. Now, I'm going to walk through a couple of really high-level architectural concepts that are driving our thinking. Now, we see eRequesting as being a significant use case on FHIR. We don't want to be building standalone solutions. We want to see eRequesting as a significant use case within FHIR that it acts in many respects like any other sort of data exchange. But in order to allow every system and participant in the ecosystem to navigate the ecosystem, we think we need a record locator service. So this is a central index of all the records of every consumer. It's a bit like an index library card. And when it's backed up by strong identity management, consent frameworks, and an authorization service, we can use this to help everyone navigate every record in the ecosystem. Now, distributed data architecture, I'm preaching to the converted here. requires a new mindset. We have many people in government, many people in the private sector who still have an attitude that the only way to get value from data is to hold it all in one central repository. We know that FHIR gives us the opportunity to spread data out throughout the ecosystem and allow data to live where it was created. And what we're looking for government to provide is safe ways to quickly navigate that system with the right authority. And one of the benefits of this, one of the big upsides, is that we don't have government honeypots that are vulnerable or a big target for cyber attacks. The next concept is around subscriptions and notifications. FHIR is a really modern framework that is built on an event-driven architecture. So being able to have one system subscribe to another system and listen for updates to records or conditions within that system is a very powerful way of rapidly keeping the entire ecosystem up to date. Now, we can support this through the record locator service by turning that service into what we call the master subscriber. So if the Commonwealth is subscribing to IHIs in every system connected to the ecosystem, we can keep the record locator service up to date with small metadata records that showed for each patient what happened, when it happened, and where is the record. And in turn, systems connected to the ecosystem can subscribe to the Commonwealth for the IHIs that they have responsibility for. This way we can keep the ecosystem up to date almost in real time. Now we know with technologies such as Kafka, we've seen this scale to enormous levels. LinkedIn, for instance, using an event-driven architecture, manage up to 800 billion messages per day. So this is certainly not a problem with lots of messages flying around the system in near real time. We need to navigate the exchange of data with confidence and safety. And we have a view that there is a need to know principle around data. We shouldn't just have open access to everybody's data across the ecosystem. So the idea of creating a central trust service that manages identity, authorization, and token management and consent services is something that we're really looking at. And that will allow practice management systems or clinical information systems, as an example, to when they need data, to come to the trust services, identify themselves. The trust service would figure out what they're able to see, issue them a token that they can then exchange with, let's say, an EMR, for instance, who can then assess that token. They can even verify it if they need to, and based on that, return the records to the requester. Now, this means that we don't have to have really complex point-to-point solutions where firms and systems need to create contracts and ways of working and their own consent models and their own identity models. If everyone who enters the ecosystem is connected to the trust services and they're trusted by government, then we can all operate in this ecosystem without actually having to know each other or assess each other individually. So it's going to really simplify onboarding into the ecosystem and the exchange of information between all sorts of parties. Now, the last principle that we want to walk through is how we approach this. So the principle is around government only providing the critical services that are necessary to make the ecosystem work, but then backing those services and backing some aspects of interoperability by strong policy frameworks. This means that we can have those services operate in very centralized, trusted way. Everyone can trust those services. And we can also start to stimulate opportunities for smaller new developers to access the ecosystem rapidly and cheaply. Before I go on to the ecosystem itself, are there any questions about the principles that people want to drop into the chat? Is there anything burning? All right, I'll keep moving on. I'll run through the high level of this ecosystem pretty quickly, and we can deep dive on any areas of interest a little bit later if we have time. So we've talked about, we all understand fire as the backbone, the spine of this ecosystem. We all understand how through fire APIs, systems are going to connect to it. So down the bottom, we have the systems we think government will operate, such as the record locator service and a consolidated national provider directory. Now, government has no shortage of provider directories that do all sorts of different and interesting tasks. What we're looking at doing is not replacing those with one provider directory to rule them all, but consolidating them down into one service. Now, we may need to add additional data fields. We may need to collect new data, such as system endpoints or service offerings. And thanks to Andy and Angus for letting us know about this new upcoming standard around offer that's coming in fire. But the consolidated national provider directory certainly will help in ordering services or requesting services. It'll help in consumers navigating the healthcare system and finding providers that can fulfill the requests that they've been given. Associated with that, we've got the MBS codes and mapping service. We've heard over the last 6 or so months around the difficulties in going from a provider ordering requesting a service through to a clinician requesting a service, a provider fulfilling that service, and the government paying for that service, and the complication involved in mapping between those things and the lack of confidence that creates, particularly for clinicians and providers in understanding whether they're going to get paid. And that lack of confidence can be projected through to the consumer, and that's something we want to try and simplify. Now, we recognize this is a massive task. There are already lots of pieces of work coming together like RSS and PITUS, and we certainly don't underestimate the complexity, both technically and politically, in building a service like that. But this is something that we see evolving over a long period of time. We've talked also about consent and authorization and identity. The identity is particularly important. We see that evolving throughout a lot of government services at the moment. Certainly services like PRODA have a long roadmap to evolve and become more standardized with other forms of government digital identity. But over time, we would like very strong confidence in the identity of every person operating in the ecosystem. That simply just builds trust and confidence in the entire system. Now we've got the public eRequest repository. This is something we may or may not build. It will depend on industry's ability to build an effective federation of eRequest repositories, whether they're built within practice management systems or they're standalone systems. So this is an area that we're going to pay a lot of attention to around whether we do or do not build this capability. If there's a market failure, we'll build it, or there may be a great opportunity if it's simple to build something that starts to lead the way, to stimulate industry, to allow small players, small software vendors to use a capability cheaply and effectively. Now, at the top layer of this ecosystem map, we've got consumer health apps. We can certainly see a very important role in eRequesting for these types of apps, such as the My Health app. We may see Apple and Google and health insurance companies start to play in this space, as they have in the US and other countries. This is going to be a really important way for consumers to navigate the healthcare system and manage their requests and, down the track, prescriptions and referrals and things like that. Paper requests are going to live on for a long time, and we probably will see two flavors of this persisting for quite some time. The first flavor is the very manual type of request, and the next that will be introduced will be a paper version of a digital request, and that may have tools like QR codes that contain an address for the request in the ecosystem, and a token that helps transfer consent and allow providers to access the request and other associated clinical records, as we heard earlier. Practice management systems are going to play an incredibly important role here in helping clinicians create and manage requests and choose the right kind of request for their patient. We'll see the emergence of electronic clinical decision support systems playing in this space, and I think we'll see a lot of value created within the practice management systems. Now, practice management systems may contain eRequest repositories, or they may be built as standalone tools offered by software industries to be used independently. Pathology and DI systems obviously critical to this as the consumer of the requests, and the state and private EMR systems may operate in a way that captures the practice management side and the provider side. How are we doing on time?
Yeah, you're going well for time. Yep.
All right. That covers the high level. Jeremy, would you like us to dive down into the detail with some questions?
Yeah, I think that's probably a good space to pause for questions. There's a bit of conversation happening in the chat throughout this, which has been interesting to listen to and watch. Is there anyone that has a specific question at this point? Everyone's being shy today. It's not like this group.
It means it's either really good or it's embarrassingly bad.
Well, I might be embarrassingly bad then, but I do have just one around the identity there, David, Jeremy. So is it fair to say then that MyGov is likely to be the basis of the trust? The MyGov identities will be the basis of the trust network?
Look, it certainly is a great opportunity, and we're seeing government more broadly start to embrace MyGov and MyGov ID as a way of establishing trust. Now, if we look at the DTA's Trusted Digital Identity Framework, they are also pointing to other identity providers being able to provide that digital identity for people operating in government services. And they're also looking at how MyGov ID becomes an identity provider for commercial services as well. So that's way off in the future. It's certainly a possibility.
Can I maybe jump in there, David? We've actually got Ryan Maven from the Digital Health Agency, one of the senior executive that's going to be helping to drive some of this work into the future. So I might just call out, Ryan, do you have anything you'd like to add as far as just early thinking or early considerations around the identity component, noting that this is largely to the heart of what you've been working through in your first components of being into the agency over the last few months? I think you're still on mute, Ryan.
Hear me now?
Yep.
Fantastic. So yes, look, this is clearly a key question for everyone. And as we start to think about how we're going to implement these changes, how we authenticate, etc., will be a key consideration. I would love to tell everyone what the answer is right now. I think there's still some planning that needs to be done. There's some clear options. There's some legislative things that we might need to look at around those as well too. As alluded to, though, the government trusted digital identity framework has some capabilities that are there possible for us to consider. We do actually also have a Council for Connected Care too, which we would be able to take options and decisions through to validate these potential ways forward as well. So I would just say watch this space. This is one of the items that is evolving. We just want to make sure what we go with is as flexible as we need to, but gives us the security and trust that we need for the ecosystem at large.
I think where I'm coming from too is just want to be really clear that the identity providers you choose are going to be quite broad. That we're not necessarily restricted to things, like we've got issues with NASH certificates, who actually gets those, using those as the base of a network becomes self-restricting as well. So making sure that we're able to capture all of the stakeholders that we want to be able to bring into this ecosystem. So yeah.
Hearing you loud and clear and agreed.
We've got, just before I go to you, Daniel, we've got Simon Cleverly on the line as well, who's Assistant Secretary of the Digital Health Branch and working very closely with Ryan and the agency on some of these items. So Simon, did you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, look, thanks. A great presentation, and hello to those who I haven't met before. I look after digital health for the Commonwealth Department of Health. What I would say about the question relating to MyGov is that we've got to be really careful at a principles level. What we're talking about here is continuity of care and building a more connected health system. We're not talking about government services. So although I agree with what Ryan's saying, we've obviously got to go through a process like we do with the rest of this ecosystem. We certainly don't want to land in a place where we get caught up in that space. This is about improving healthcare for Australians, not necessarily bringing everything together under some government banner. So I think we would be cautious around the concept of MyGov, but certainly as we look at digital identification and those sorts of things that Ryan's touched on, I think that's probably more likely the way that we'll be going. And again, that sort of ability to have flexibility to be built into this ecosystem as a principle is where we'll go. Thanks for letting me have the comment. Cheers.
Thanks, Simon. We might pass over to Daniel. Daniel, you've got a comment.
Yeah, look, first of all, thanks. This is really interesting. So working on looking at interoperability solutions to share data across Northern Australia back in the country the last few months. A couple of things. First of all, I think the importance, and it may be already a consideration of including allied health. I think one of the big gaps is often when data is made available, certainly at a state level, it's made available to GPs and practitioners at that level, but not necessarily to the wider ecosystem. So if I can put in a plug for that consideration right at ground level, I think that's important, maybe already there. The other thing is in terms of the whole consent and authorization process, there's a couple of comments I'd like to make. One of the issues that I've come across here is the concept of data custodians is really important to include in the process. There's certainly with our Indigenous community health providers, a lot of concern about who can access their information and such like. And I believe from my last couple of months' conversations, it's really important to have a concept of an authorization beyond just the individual level. And thirdly, to just tack on to that issue, working internationally for much of the last 10, 15 years, one of the things that I miss often in the Australian view of consent and authorization of access to clinical data is the concept of a break the seal approach for urgent access to data that normally wouldn't be available, creating an audited vent and such like. So again, I'd just like to put in a plug for that, and also for relationship-based authorization where existing providers obviously have a simple access and non-existing have to do a break the seal. So suggestions, thoughts, just wanted to put it in there.
To dive deeper on that topic, we're at a very early stage of thinking about that, and we recognise that the consent problem is big and hairy and complicated.
Absolutely.
And everyone's going to have an opinion. The opinions range from some of the hospital systems that say there should be no consent model, we need everything, through to the privacy advocates who will say consumers need granular level, detailed consent model for everything, and they need live consent models. I think where it may end up is somewhere in between, but it will only get there through deep consultation with everybody to come up with an acceptable model. Thanks.
Really, really good call outs, Daniel. Thank you for those comments. We'll take those on board. Just noting that you just called out EMR systems, David. I might pass over to Phil. Phil, have you got a comment?
Yeah, one quick comment here. So I guess I was going to say, do you have, as part of this presentation or planned maybe at a future date where we can go, seeing some of these services where we can go into the data model and the data play around how an example might work? Because even the example you had, can't remember, it was a slide or two ago, between the PMS and EMR side, to me, that didn't quite fit the eRequesting scenario, but might fit in a larger health information exchange or sharing of other clinical data. So I guess my mind's going in a lot of different ways, but maybe not in the way that you're thinking. So I guess my quick request is, do we have a point where we could go spend a lot more time and kind of understand that, maybe at a conceptual level, not at individual FHIR specifications, but understand the implications of that data moving or proposed data moving?
Yeah, I think that would be really useful, actually, Phil, to have some of those conversations going forward. That's something that we certainly want to partner with the agency to bring forward, that kind of thinking now, and start to explore out what these concepts could look like and where the hurdles are. I mean, obviously, as I said at the start, this is a thought bubble. We are bringing it together, some concepts, and sort of smashing them together to make sure that, to see if they will work and to test that. And part of this process is the learning process back, right? It's the feedback that we're going to get from all of you on that bit works, but that bit's got a problem, and we're going to need to tweak this a bit more for this to be an actual design. So this is part of the hopefully the gold in this process now, and in the next few months will be having these conversations, working through, where are the opportunities, where are the problems, where have we not thought it through enough, or where have we sort of oversimplified something, and how do we get through to an outcome that's achievable. So yeah, absolutely happy to organise those, Phil.
The next few months for us is about getting to that next level of technical design. And we need lots of input. We need to crash those, use cases against this many, many times in many different ways to check what's working, what's not working. I think Angus had a question.
Yeah, pass over to our co-chair, Angus.
Hi, I just wanted to make a comment, and I did get a sneak peek of this yesterday, and I missed it, but I don't see the word authentication here. So I would like to think that we have a service that allows us to authenticate each other, so that Sonic can talk to Helios or Queensland Health. But it's a government service where we get a token to say we're Sonic Healthcare, and then we provide that to Helios and say, hey, we're Sonic Healthcare, let's talk. So that's not identity, and it's not authorization, it's authentication. And I just, on that, also wanted to make the point that whilst authorization is a big hard problem, and for everyone, there's certainly a bubble of data, and that is the government data, which it's in your court to nut through how you authorize people to be able to access that data. But it also highlight that if you give us authentication, so that business A can talk to business B with trust from the government, then I'd like to think that we can authorize ourselves, like we decide who can access our data as per the other businesses decide who accesses their data. So just pointing out that authorization is in your scope, in a government scope, is to your data, and that might be my health record data, but realize that if you allow us to talk with trust to each other out here in the health community, then you can somewhat leave authorization to us, like we decide who accesses our data. But primarily I wanted to call out that authentication, provide a service that allows us out here to talk to each other with trust.
lot of work to do in this space. Very, very early days. But yeah, thanks for that.
Yeah, just calling out one of the comments I just saw in the chat too. Ken, your comment about mapping to MVS codes and so forth. Look, we're not being flippant about this. We understand the complexity that's in that. It is a really difficult task to suggest that we're going to do that kind of work. We know that there's others that have gone before us that have failed in doing that, and we know the size of maintaining it even once you do map it. For us, that's a bit of a stretch goal. We think it needs to happen in the long term to get the value, but it's not something that we think needs to happen immediately to get an MVP up, if that makes sense. We could have an ecosystem that's running successfully and work towards that kind of a goal. But I do think if we're going to start thinking about a future state that is a bit more dynamic and is trying to get a win for everybody, that we're going to need to start thinking at some point in the future about an ecosystem that's able to bridge the gap between clinical need and clinical appropriateness and payment systems, and being able to provide a payment to a business at the point of service, as opposed to in the weeks and months that follow, is something that's quite realistic in this day and age, and something we should be working towards, even if it is difficult, even if it's going to take us a lot of time, and it's one of those big wicked problems.
Across government, there is a principle that's starting to be looked at around using natural business data to fulfill regulatory requirements. Now, we've seen the ATO do this. Is a master stroke of genius with single touch payroll. It's just about pay slips, and they take care of all of the regulatory control based on timesheets effectively. The trade space is starting to move to this around just taking trade data and then running regulatory processes out of the back of that. And this is where we would love to get down the track, is to take clinical process data and use that to run regulatory processes and payment processes. We can reduce enormous amounts of workload within providers and clinicians' businesses if we can start using that data more effectively for the regulatory processes.
Yeah, I made that comment partly because of my role on the Medicare Review Advisory Committee, and we have had this issue raised about the modernisation of the schedule, and our conservative estimate would be that it would take 10 years to do that. But I agree with you that it doesn't mean that because it's going to take 10 years we don't do it. It means we start somewhere and have a plan of how to eat, chew this big sandwich in front of us. So and probably in a way that's, with modern thinking rather than automating decades-old thinking.
Yeah, I agree, Ken. And as we said, this is just early thinking in terms of how we might consider a future state. We've got to do a lot more planning in terms of what that might look like and how we might stage it all. Absolutely agree. And it is a big problem, but it's not something that we want to just take off the table. It's something that we need to address at some point. Michael, you've been very patient.
It's all right.
You always are.
Thank you. Well, I've enjoyed the presentation. I'm probably similar to Phil, have a next level down style question. There seems to be a lot of overlay with the Health Information Exchange, or the HIE here. And it'd be good to understand how the interoperability, for want of a better word, between this thinking and that thinking is occurring, because it does feel like that's becoming quite a major dependency on the execution of this. And it'd be great to see a little bit more next level down thinking on that. I know that's probably still unfolding, and I like the concept of the record locator service. I think that's a really good concept. It's just the next level down. I know you touched on that, David, but I'd just love to understand how you see that playing out over, say, this year, next couple of years.
So I guess the first call out, Dave, if I can, is that the relationship between eRequesting, or our eRequesting national ecosystem that we're sort of playing out and trying to think through, and the Health Information Exchange that the agency's been working through, they are absolutely in sync, and they should be. We don't want to be recreating services and so forth and duplicating services. We absolutely should be reusing our infrastructure. That's the first call out. So you're right, you're absolutely right. There is a dependency between eRequesting and the HIE conversation. The HIE conversation is much bigger than eRequesting, and that's really important to understand. It's a much bigger conversation. It's a much more complicated conversation, and it's something that the agency have been working through methodically over the past period, and they'll continue to do that. So, you know, Ryan, I'll let you jump in if you want to, but this is something that the agency are taking very seriously. They're listening to the conversations in eRequesting. We see eRequesting as almost like the use case of the health information exchange, if that makes sense. And these sort of concepts that we're playing out here are, again, things that are being considered at a very high level within the HIE conversation and planning. Sorry, Ryan, you're on mute.
Thanks, Jeremy. I will just add, so the eRequesting use cases and scenarios we're talking through here do test a reasonable portion of the HIE, or the Health Information Exchange, technical capabilities. So yes, the HIE is much bigger than just eRequesting, but there are a great number of touch points. So we're talking about provider information being linked in. So how many of the provider repositories that we talked about earlier will be accessed through the HIE, that information flows into the eRequesting type pieces. Allied health was called out earlier. We've got allied health information in provider sources. How do we make sure that's connected through so they're not forgotten through this whole process? So it is a big picture, but we are absolutely doing these things in unison, in lockstep. And yes, we don't want to create an ecosystem that needs to be rebuilt within 2 to 3 years. That's not going to help anyone.
Yeah, absolutely. I hope that answered your question, Mike. Do we have any other questions that want to be raised by the group here and now? I mean, there are going to be opportunities for further conversation and questions to be raised, and we're happy to take anything in writing too. If you want to go away and just absorb it and come back at a later point, that is absolutely okay. We understand that we've thrown a lot of information at you. I apologize for that. So sort of sorry, but not sorry. You asked for it. We're just giving it to you. But I get that it's going to take a bit of time to work through it and to just absorb what this means. I want to reiterate, though, what I said at the start. This is absolutely not an agreed plan forward for government. This is a thought bubble. We are trying to be transparent. We are trying to work in a different way. We are trying to work with you to show you what we're investigating, what we're thinking about. We want to hear from you on what works and what doesn't, what is a good idea and what isn't, and why. We don't actually, that's really important. We don't just want to know what's a good idea and what isn't. We need to know why it's a good idea or why it isn't. Because if you just say that sucks, we're probably going to ignore you. If you say it sucks because of these reasons, we're likely to listen to you very deeply. So give your feedback. We really want to hear it. The agency want to hear it. They've got, they're very much open to the feedback, as are we. And these concepts will continue to iterate and evolve over the next sort of 12 to 18 months or so. We will keep trying to give you updates and provide feedback to the broader group as we can, as things start to evolve. But the purpose of this document, the purpose of giving you this presentation was, again, to try to help provide some more guidance around building an implementation guide in FHIR, but nothing more. It's just showing you of the kind of concepts we need to start planning for within a FHIR strategy and within a FHIR standard, not to lock in what future infrastructure might be and might not be. We just want to make sure that you understand where we're heading and what the sort of things that we're considering as so far as the things that sit on top of FHIR, the things that FHIR is going to need to be able to move within, so that we don't lock down that standard to a point where it's not usable when we implement it. So on that note, I might hand it back over to you, Danielle, for an update on our face-to-face catch-ups in February.
Thanks, Jeremy. So I'll share my screen and talk about what we're doing in our next meeting. So we will be face-to-face. So the 14th of February is part of the 2-day Sparked workshop, with the 13th day, the clinical design group is coming together and meeting. And the 14th is the technical design group day. These are in Melbourne. Although the tickets have closed, if you haven't registered and you can come, there's the link there. These slides will be on the minutes page in Confluence, and you can get on the wait list. Since we've got Kate or Michael Hosking on the line, do you want to just give a brief overview of the clinical design group day?
Sure. So in terms of the approach for the clinical design group day, we're going to run through and talk through some of the identified use cases and workflows and go through them in a reasonable amount of detail in terms of what's expected at various levels of experience from the consumer, provider, and clinician experience. And then once we've sort of, also looked at those priority use cases and formulated them in a reasonable detail, we'll look at the complementary data flows and the data requirements from the clinical perspective and consumer perspective, and make sure that we're happy with them to the point we're able to then pass them we expect in terms of the priorities and the experience and workflows from a data perspective. And then ideally there'll be a feedback loop that we'll work through to ensure that if there's any clarifications or uncertainties that we can work through them together. Thanks, Danielle.
Which leads us into that 14th Technical Design Group Day. And Philip put in the comments the question of, will we be dealing with those data flows, the use cases and the data model in the technical space? And we absolutely will be. So we'll kick off the 13th is going through with the Clinical Design Group. And as we come into the 14th, that first session is getting a summary of what were those outcomes, what are the prioritized sets, what's being considered to be of the clinical and the consumer highest priorities. And then we want to go through in the technical focus to go through the use cases and have that analysis to prioritize those through our perspectives, and to then get into the data model mapping and looking at mapping across the workflows and how will we bring this into FHIR and what will we come to in a first release of the AU eRequesting FHIR IG. So I will ask technical design group members, please again, have a look at the use cases. We've already got a proposed starting set from the technical design group. Please come prepared to discuss those. And if you can, bring 3 requesting things you can't live without, things that you think are crucial. Bring those in. We want to bring them in and discuss where and how do they actually fit in across the ecosystem and across the workflows. And then there's the usual on complete the members checklist, make sure you're signed up, ready to go, and start to read about FHIR workflows, which will really help us in talking about how we're going to map across how that data moves and how it gets represented in FHIR. And that's, I've also got the member checklist here. These slides will be available, and this just gives you the links off to how to make sure that you'll be able to stay in contact and be able to actually provide the feedback on those use cases, which will be signing up for a HL7 account, and that gives you the access to Confluence to add in your feedback. And that's all I really wanted to share about the next session. Are there any questions on that?
Danielle, Marvin had a comment about how do we provide feedback? Oh, it's there, sorry. How do we provide feedback on the requesting hypothesis? And then Joy's put something in the comments. Okay, cool.
Yeah, so we're happy to receive feedback via email. We've just put in our email address there. So happy for anyone to send through some questions, and we'll respond in kind. But so when the minutes go up, there'll be a copy of the hypothesis document to review as well. So we expect there'll be a few questions and comments coming through, and happy to respond.
Also, just maybe from the CDG perspective, in addition to what Danielle's mentioned about the technical design group around bringing those 3 things that you can't live without, for those that are also joining the clinical design group, we'd really appreciate your ideas around what are the priority things from a workflow and I guess a use case scenario, things that you can't live without. So that 3 set of priorities that will be able to help craft the day in terms of understanding what's keeping you up at night from an eRequesting perspective.
Okay, well, with that note, I'm going to call the meeting to a close. We've got 2 minutes back in your diaries, everyone. Go and have some lunch. Thank you so much for your attendance. I really appreciate such a strong turnout today, and look forward to seeing you in February.
Thanks, Jeremy. Thanks, David.
Thanks.
Thanks. Cheers.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.